Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello and welcome to episode 97 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises on Gypsy House in the village of Great Missenden in Buckinghamshire, England, the long-standing family home of the famous children's author Roald Dahl. It is afternoon in the early summer of 1983, and the house is in some turmoil. First, because Dahl's newly arrived fiancée, Felicity Crossland, has initiated a program of disruptive renovations in the house. In fact, Dahl's life has only recently been unsettled by his divorce from his wife of 30 years, the renowned American actress Patricia Neal, the marriage having been undermined by his 10-year-long affair with Felicity. On this particular day, however, the immediate source of the turmoil is the outrage that has erupted following the publication of a book review by Dahl, in which his criticism of the Israeli bombardment of Lebanon has crossed the line into explicit antisemitism. In the review, Dahl expressed horror at a race of people who had switched so rapidly from much-pitied victims to barbarous murderers. All of these bare facts to this point are true, and are the premise for the play that is to follow, which dramatizes an imagined encounter where representatives from both Dahl's British and American publishers, along with Felicity, attempt to persuade him to soften his published stance to preserve his reputation and their commercial interests. This is the electrifying drama Giant, which is currently playing at the Harold Pinter Theatre in London's West End, having transferred after its acclaimed run at the Royal Court Theatre last autumn. Giant has rightly received rave reviews and awards, including at the Olivier's this year, where it was Best New Play, and John Lithgow won Best Actor for his towering performance as Dahl. Forgive the pun, but he does indeed have Dahl's famous height, as well as his immense curmudgeonly charisma. The whole cast of six is without exception excellent, Elliot Levy also winning the Olivier for Best Supporting Actor as Dahl's British publisher Tom Mashler. All of this is more extraordinary for the fact that it is its author's first play. It is a play full of thorny moral issues that are hugely topical, including the potential conflict between the character of the artist and our appreciation for their art, and most pointedly, it addresses the conflation of opposition to actions by the State of Israel with anti-Semitism. So topically sensitive is this latter theme that on the night that I saw the play, a member of the audience shouted out objections at the stage, and a couple of people walked out. It is an utterly riveting roller coaster experience in the theatre, thought-provoking and entertaining in the best possible way. I'm hugely delighted to be joined by its author, Mark Rosenblatt, to explore his amazing play. Welcome, Mark. Thanks so much for joining me on the Play Podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's an honor.
I need to introduce you properly. Before he wrote the play, Mark has worked for more than 25 years as a freelance theatre director across the UK and internationally, directing productions at Shakespeare's Globe, the National Theatre, Sheffield Theatres, Northampton, Leeds Playhouse, the Edinburgh Festival, the Young Vic, the West End, and I could go on and on and on. He was a full-time associate director at Leeds Playhouse, directing 9 main house productions. Before that, he was the associate at the National Theatre Studio. He is also a screenwriter, writing and directing the award-winning short film Ganef, and co-writing Dominic Dromgoole's feature film debut Making Noise Quietly. So Mark, you have said that you never planned to write this play or any play at all. So how did you come to write it and why this particular subject?
Yeah, I really always felt in all my years working that playwriting was someone else's gift. I'd been to see so many, as we all do, so many plays, particularly, at places like the Royal Court, and the idea of constructing something from dialogue that's so raw and, that's so dependent on a live experience and that can't cut away in the way that film does. I had written a little for film that develops themes and jokes and plot and all the things I had watched in such admiration of other, proper playwrights. It all felt to me like, something that someone else did. But the thing that directors do is sometimes we have ideas for plays and we look to find writers to write them. In this case, I had an idea but not a plan to be the playwright. And initially I went to have coffee, and this is around about 2018, with Nick Heitner, who had been the artistic director, of course, at the National Theatre, was now running the Bridge Theatre. I went to talk to him as a producer, really, to see if the idea was interesting to him, to see if I could find that elusive playwright to write it. And he was the one that said in that moment, why didn't you write it? And Nick is just such a major figure in our industry. And I thought, well, if he thinks it's a good idea, maybe it's worth entertaining the idea of writing it. It would be disingenuous of me to say I had never written anything in my life. I had started to write for film over the last few years. And I've obviously worked and developed plays over the years with many writers and been part of that process. But it is a very different challenge, actually, being the one who's tapping away on your keyboard and filling those blank pages with dialogue and with theme and all the stuff I've just said. So long story short, I ended up spending about 2 or 3 years, working on it.
And what was it that drew you to this subject?
Well, so I'd always loved Roald Dahl's work growing up, and I still do. But at the time, in about 2018, there had been an inquiry, a major inquiry into anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And as a British Jew, I was keenly interested in what was being discovered. There was a lot of evidence coming out in the discourse around Israel-Palestine that was, on the one hand, meaningful, constructive, sincere, and then on the other hand, there seems to be a number of instances in which that conversation was being blurred with something darker, a kind of prejudiced, often sometimes quite medieval anti-Semitism, using medieval tropes to stoke up the political conversation. And it was shocking to hear some of that stuff, and I thought it would be interesting to see if there was a way of dramatizing it. How could you prize apart the difference between those two things? And I remembered that Dahl had been accused of anti-Semitism in his lifetime. It was a distant bell, but I looked up the source of that, and it was an article he'd written, the one you described, which seemed to me to be a perfect mirror in some ways of some of that evidence that I'd been reading about. And then it sort of dawned on me that that was a great premise, that there was someone with a lot to lose, a public figure at home in the summer of 1983, dealing with the fallout in the press, the outcry in the press around what he'd written. And it seemed like a rich premise for a play.
Amazing how you got from the Labour Party to Roald Dahl. And I imagine that all our listeners will be familiar with Dahl, primarily, of course, through his books such as James and the Giant Peach, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and Matilda, and the many screen versions thereof, of course. But it'd be fascinating by way of background to know more about him and his life, particularly what led up to the time of the play. What was going on in his life in 1983 when the play is set?
Well, I mean, again, as you've described accurately, he'd just gone through a divorce. He had been having an affair with Felicity Crossland for 11 years. The divorce ended the marriage and the affair became a public relationship, and Felicity had just moved in to their legendary home that they had lived in for 30 plus years in Great Missenden. So he was, dealing with a huge moment of upheaval. The relationship with Patricia Neal was complex and full of love and full of children and a big life.
Yeah, they had 5 children, didn't they? And also had lived through some traumas themselves.
Exactly. And she had been very ill, a very sudden illness that Dahl had. He was an extraordinarily tenacious human being, a pathological fixer of problems, like I feel reading about him, that it's referenced in the play. Their son, Theo, had been struck whilst in his pram in New York by a taxi at some traffic lights, had suffered brain injuries, and Dahl had seen the valve that was drawing liquid off between his brain and his skull and realized that it was not doing a very good job. And obviously that would concern any parent, but I think where Dahl becomes a slightly different proposition is that Dahl decided to make a new one. He found a neurologist, he found an inventor, and they together collaborated and patented a new valve which went on the mass market eventually. The same sort of attitude applied to Patricia. When she was ill, he devised, in effect, a very robust process of helping her rehabilitate, which again became a new approach to occupational therapy. So there was an incredible investment of love, and also they tragically lost a daughter, age 7, Olivia, to encephalitis. So a marriage and a life really informed by joy and incredible challenges. So I'm sure that the ending of that marriage was very painful, very difficult. And so in the summer of 83, we find him with a woman who is by profession a brilliant interior decorator and runs her own company, and has decided that now that she is the chatelaine, effectively, the lady of the house, she's going to reimagine this space so that her new husband-to-be, they're engaged at this moment, could also enjoy, Dahl's back was in such an acute state of pain from lifelong injuries that started, I think, in the war when his plane crashed. He had several spinal fusions in his spine. At this point, at this age...
He's 67 at this point, right?
Yeah. He can't walk upstairs. And so his bedroom is now going to be on the ground floor. So she's trying to shape and streamline his life so that he also can be as productive as possible with his work.
As you say, it's a point of great change in his life, given the stability of 30 years there in this place. And now there's someone else with him, and the house is literally being remodeled around him.
And Dahl was also a stickler for his routine. I mean, a decades-long writing routine, which involved very specific working hours, very specific drinking hours, very specific listening to the racing hours. And for that to be disrupted by dust and builders and all of that would have added to his very bad mood.
Yeah, very unsettling. And yes, he's in a very bad mood a lot of the time. So for those who haven't yet had a chance to see the play yet, could you give us a brief introduction to the other characters that we see on the stage, and perhaps a very brief summary of the main action points of the play? Now, I must issue a spoiler warning here, because if you haven't yet had the pleasure of going to see the play, we are going to probably give away some spoilers here. In fact, almost definitely. So you could turn off now and come back later after you've seen the play, but otherwise we're going to plow on, I'm afraid. So Mark, can we just set the scene? Who else is on this stage and what happens?
Well, I mean, I guess the first thing to say is the play happens in effect, bar an interval, in real time, across a single afternoon on a summer's day in 1983. And the action of the play is the visit of his English publisher and a representative of his American publishers to encourage him, in concert with Lissy, his fiancée, to consider making some kind of conciliatory statement, even possibly an apology, but something public, to ease and calm and soothe some of the outcry that followed the article that he wrote, particularly because there's a new book that's coming out, The Witches, which he's actually in the process at the beginning of the play of proofing. So the action of the play is really the attempts by that group of three, Jessie Stone, an American in her 30s who's a sales director at Farrar Straus Giroux, his American publisher, Tom Mashler, the whiz kid of British publishing at the time, and was a friend of Dahl's, and Lissy, who we've talked about. And then on the edges of that is also a couple of other characters in the household. A young New Zealand housekeeper, Hallie, who is their sort of sprightly, lively cook and general housekeeper. And Dahl's long-standing gardener, handyman, Wally Saunders, who is a very big man himself, like Dahl, who was a real person and one of the sources of inspiration for the BFG.
One of the important things to say is that the play is a hybrid of the real and the imagined. So the circumstances of Dahl publishing the Incendiary Book Review are true, and some of his words and quotations from the review are also verbatim in the play. Tom Mashler, as you said, was in reality Dahl's UK publisher. But the character of Jessie Stone, the US publisher, is entirely your invention, and we'll come to talk about her and why you did that and what she represents. But one of the things that struck me as most extraordinary about the play is that in what amounts to an extended wordy debate about some serious issues, there is such an excruciating tension. Even fireworks, especially in the relationship between Dahl and Jessie Stone. He prods and goads her mercilessly, and she's understandably on edge. She's much younger, and she's been sent into the bear pit here to somehow help calm things down to protect the commercial interests of the publisher, because they have received letters from booksellers who are saying they're going to destock Dahl's books, and Dahl has received a death threat even, and there's a policeman actually standing on guard outside the house when the play opens. So there's some serious repercussions. It's a fascinating debate about timely issues, a really eloquent, intelligent discussion. And what is amazing to me, Mark, is that you conceived and wrote this play before the events of October 7th, 2023, taking the book review that Dahl wrote as the starting point. What was going on in Israel and Lebanon in 1982? Did you think, well, this is something that's going on today? Because it hadn't actually happened.
No, I mean, as I said, I pitched the idea for the play in 2018, and I started writing it properly after the research in 2020. So, yeah, of course, no one had any idea what was going to happen. That said, the situation in Israel and Palestine is a perennial source of great complexity and anguish. So there has, over the decades, been surges of activity and conflict.
So what was happening in 1982, actually? Can you just remind us?
Yeah, so in 1982, the PLO were firing a lot of rockets into northern Israel. This is the stated reason why Ariel Sharon led an incursion into Lebanon, invaded Lebanon, with the initial stated aim of pushing Hezbollah, I keep saying Hezbollah, of course, because it's so close to the parallels with now, to the PLO. They said they wanted to push them 25 miles up into Lebanon to prevent them from firing these rockets. And once they got into Lebanon, they just kept going. And they ended up besieging West Beirut, decimating West Beirut, huge civilian casualties. And then there were 2 massacres in displaced persons camps, not directly perpetrated by the Israeli army, but under their oversight. And that in itself takes a lot of unpacking. I won't go into a lot of detail about it, but it caused an enormous amount of hostility to Israel and to the Israeli army. And there was also huge protests from Israelis in Israel itself about this military invasion and the fatalities. It was a time of incredible tension and tragedy. And this book that Dahl reviewed was an Australian journalist. Tony Clifton was embedded in West Beirut at the time of this siege. And he wrote about what was happening in the city. It's a coruscating analysis of the carnage at street level. There's many photographs in it taken by Catherine Leroy, an amazing war photographer, of the casualties, particularly of children who'd lost limbs. It's very disturbing, and very disturbing for Dahl, who had already been engaged in raising money for all sorts of charities involving children in war zones and in danger around the world, but had been particularly involved with raising money for Palestine in the lead up to reviewing the book. So he was already bringing to that book some real political anger.
So the history sounds all too sadly familiar, doesn't it? I mean, the resonances are extraordinary with the current issues around criticism or support for Israel or Palestine. So obviously and hugely sensitive.
And I should say that the Royal Court, where we premiered the play, programmed the play formally on the 5th of October 2023.
Oh my God, wow.
And 2 days later, obviously, when everything changed in that region and the ripples went outward globally, I thought, well, this play is so close to the bone that, you know, I would have forgiven David Byrne at the Royal Court for having pause for thought about whether to program it or not, because it was such a raw moment. And they were unerring in their decision to program it.
That's fantastic. But given how sensitive it is and topical, and I referenced my experience at the theater where there were people obviously upset by what was going on the stage, I'm interested to know what response you've had to the play, either from audiences in the theater or perhaps even to you personally.
Well, it's interesting that you were there that night, because if I'm thinking of the night that you're describing, it was the only night that I'm aware of where someone has shouted from the audience.
Okay.
Like I said, we were programmed just before October 7th. We didn't go on stage for a full year, nearly. We premiered September 24. So there was a full year of this conflict building and escalating. And by the time we went into previews, Israel had in fact gone into Lebanon. It had been mainly about Gaza and has obviously come back to Gaza. I mean, Gaza's never stopped being a major focus of everyone's concerns. But it was extraordinary because in previews, Israel were bombing Beirut, as these characters on stage talked about a siege of Beirut. So we were going into previews, all of us were bracing ourselves slightly for vocal reactions during the show, for walkouts, for protests and things like that. And what was really amazing and assuring in some way was that that never really happened at all, other than the night you went. I mean, I'm not saying that no one's ever vocalized anything in the auditorium, but as far as we know, it's really been wonderful in some way to realize that because the play speaks to many different political perspectives, it seems to be reasonably inclusive of a very wide range of points of view. And because the play is not interested in deciding who the winner, as it were, of the argument is, it means that I think an audience doesn't feel hectored by the play, or parts of the audience don't feel hectored by the play or told what to think. I think it invites you to think. And so rather than reconstructing the sort of defensive political scrapping that happens online, there's a slightly longer form playing out of different ideas that mean that an audience can be challenged and certainly made uncomfortable, but not necessarily hectored or scolded.
Well, I think you've done an extraordinary job, Dan, because some of the issues that you touch on are somewhat of a minefield in terms of how carefully one might have to tread, because it is a febrile atmosphere we're living in and people have very passionate and strong opinions. It's a very complicated set of circumstances to trying to understand or judge. And it is extraordinary, I guess, testament to the balance you've struck, as you mentioned, that there weren't more of the kind of protests. I wasn't even sure what this person who was shouting from the audience was saying. I don't know what they were objecting to specifically. All I do know is that even in our own house, and I'm sure in many in that audience who come out of that play, it stimulates quite extensive conversations around some of the issues that we are witnessing and experiencing today. And also, it can be hard to watch at times, to listen to Dahl in particular. His anti-Semitism becomes quite explicit. All of it's very disturbing in that sense. So have you had come back on those terms?
I mean, there have been a couple of articles that I'm aware of that feel that the play doesn't sufficiently explore certain points of view or make certain arguments too vulnerable to criticism. But in the main, no, it feels that people, are held by the range of points of view expressed on stage and feel that they reflect enough the kind of wider conversation. But I never set out to write something that was a hatchet job on Roald Dahl. I still read his books to my boys. I still admire enormously his imagination and his skill. I love it, and they mean a great deal to me, the books. And Dahl, even in the play, it was very important to me that he himself has some very compelling and sincere things to say about the political situation that you can't help but listen to. Even though he then goes on to muddy that with prejudice, he also speaks very compassionately. So the intention of the play is not to sort of paint villainy and heroism, but to show that, we're all paradoxical.
Yeah, and it certainly does that. I think it's important that we can move on to talk about these characters because this is also a personal story of these characters. As you've said, it's not a polemic about these issues that they're debating. These are very real and timely and topical issues. There's a lot going on here about, as you started with, the conflation of anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel and its government or its military for particular actions, how Jewish people are expected to respond to that. And I'd like to talk about that in relation to the character of Tom Maschler and also, of course, Jesse Stone, who is also Jewish. And initially, when I was thinking about how to approach talking to you about this, it was with some trepidation about how deeply we would get into what Tom Maschler calls the hornet's nest of Israel and all of these things. But I think we've probably done enough to indicate that it's very sensitively, I think, balanced in the way it plays out. And that's interesting you say about that balance of sympathy based on Dahl himself, for example, because he is an extraordinarily complicated character, is he not? We both warmed to and at other times reviled him How would you describe what he's made of?
I mean, in some ways, he is the product of the 1920s, 30s public school system. He was built for running an empire, and he inhaled the sort of lazy, prejudiced outlook of those schools at that time, who were teaching people on some level to view the world in neat groups, reduced to sort of stereotypes, because how else do you manage a vast empire than to describe a certain kind of person from a certain kind of country in a certain kind of way, so that you can easily make the top-down decisions about how to manage that country. I mean, all the racism that went with that, he has drunk that in.
And assumed superiority.
Yeah, exactly. And at the same time, in some ways, he has a great mistrust of the system. He sees himself as anti-establishment, as a bit of a rogue, a bit of a daredevil, a bit of an independent thinker. He hates being told what to do. Probably because he was brought up in such a traumatizing public school system. The natural reaction to reject the chain of command as well as enjoy the privileges that it brings.
And also, was it because his parents were Norwegian?
Yes, exactly. So that's right. He feels he's somehow naturally an outsider, but the duality of that is a desperate desire to belong. I mean, in the play, one of the later pressures that's introduced by Lissy is that he should consider apologizing because he has been put forward for a knighthood. And there's a scene between them in which Dahl, on the one hand, seems to scorn the very idea of dancing for a knighthood, doing the right thing, pleasing the establishment, saying sorry. At the same time, he really wants it. He's so jealous of Kingsley Amis being Sir Kingsley Amis. He very interestingly felt that writing children's novels was incredibly misunderstood, undervalued. I mean, this is typical of Dahl. When he became a writer, he really wanted to write adult novels. He realized that he was very good at children's novels, but hated being patronized and was very jealous of the high esteem that great adult writers were held in. And I think the idea of being Sir Roald Dahl, which he was never made, and I think he himself later attributed to this moment, would have been a great thing for him. So he hated the things that he most wanted. And I think that's a big part of who he is, the outsider who wants to be on the inside, and the insider always craving to be on the outside. And it makes a sense of a lot of the books he wrote, which were often told from the point of view of the outsider.
Yes, and in human terms, he's a complicated combination of charming and funny, this fantastic sharp wit. But then he's sailing really close to the edge, and there are times where he crosses the line. He's just nasty and cruel, which is absolutely chilling. So it's a combination of magnetic charm and playfulness and compassion, even, as we mentioned, because he feels passionately about the suffering that's going on in Lebanon, for example, and he has compassion for, as it turns out, Jessie Stone, the American publisher, has a disabled son, and he intuits this and has empathy for her because of his own circumstances. So there's a tenderness on display there. But then there's this huge egomania, impatience, of course, the vile antisemitism. He's querulous all the time. He revels in provocation, and he's manipulative as well, isn't he?
Yeah, all of those things. I think, a lot of it relates to what I was saying earlier about his desire to fix things.
So he wanted to fix Israel.
Exactly. But without taking into account, it's not a valve to improve on. It's a complex global regional conflict full of multiple truths held dearly by different sides. And he wants to fix it with a book review, probably. And I think that is where he comes a cropper.
Because one of the things I think I've heard you say about him is that he so passionately believes in what he's saying is right in terms of the condemnation of Israel, and possibly even more underlying this, which is cloudier, of course. But he does earnestly believe it, and also probably understands something about where the criticism is going to come from, and he's trying to navigate that as well. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, he's very savvy in some ways. He's sort of predatorial, and, he has animal instincts and survival instincts because he's a traumatized person. He's been beaten heavily at school. He's got very traumatic childhood experiences. He's in pain physically. And so self-protection, survival mode is very sharp in him, and he can sense and sniff out where threats might come from. Even if he meets them with irrational anger and cruelty, he's always bobbing and weaving. But I think also, whilst, his anti-Semitism by the way, is completely self-declared. I mean, the real Roald Dahl declared himself an anti-Semite and acknowledged that publicly. But once you step away from your own moral objection to his anti-Semitism, you can sort of see why it's attractive to him, because as a writer, I can see why a very complicated situation can start to be fixed by a very simplified conspiracy theory. It is in some ways the thing that calms him down, because, of course, if you can start to describe the whole problem as being part of a sort of devilish conspiracy of Jews around the world, you can stop it being a situation of human complexity, and you can make it good against evil. And that's what he does. But he moves between more earth-grounded reason and these horrendous sort of dark fantasies that, are millennia old.
Yeah, it's fascinating that you say that he's attracted to the simple explanation, because there is an extraordinary, uncanny calmness to him when he just launches into a statement of his views, which are shocking, but he seems to do it with utter confidence of his position. I want to switch tack slightly, because one of the things that I enjoyed in the play, Mark, was his language. His language is unique in the books he writes, of course, as we famously know. And you've done a wonderful job of giving him some of his familiar inventive vocabulary, I think, that sounds like it comes right off the page from one of his books. He calls Tom a spootlicker. The publisher's office is a snory, bory London office. And there are numbers of others. And I wondered, did you consciously copy some of this, or have you made it up, coined new Dahlisms, as it were?
No, I mean, spootlicker, I invented that. I remember that moment because it was in the workshop, and he likes to embellish and develop insults as he goes.
Yes.
And one of the things that is like banter that he has with Tom Ashley is he sort of starts to tease him for being sycophantic. And he calls him schmoozy, which is obviously a Yiddish word that he playfully but, intentionally applies to Tom. And then starts to, initially I'd written bootlicker. And then I just thought it'd be fun to think, well, what kinds of... There's like a whole dictionary of Dahl's invented language that he uses in the books. And I started to see how he inverts letters. So it's my invention, but trying to use Dahl's little rules. Snory, bory... Yeah, I think once you get into a rhythm with hearing his voice, you start to play with a mixture of clubroom officer class jargon and the more extreme children's book idiom that he used in his writing. And it just becomes a lot of fun to muck around with.
Well, it's very effective. Well done.
Thank you.
Can we talk about his relationship with Lissy and the character of her that we see on the stage? For large parts of the play, she adopts the role of the peacekeeper to some degree, desperately trying to keep him in check and to find ways also to fix things. And I was thinking initially you could be forgiven for thinking that, she's also somewhat sycophantic or browbeaten even. She's too accommodating perhaps of his everything because he's very demanding. But she is in fact a formidable force, isn't she?
She is, and that was really important. First of all, I had read that she was a very strong person in real life. She's still alive. And I've never met her, but it was clear that to handle someone like Roald, you needed to be strong and tough. It would make no sense to an audience to see someone any less than that in a relationship with him. And you're right, she appears in some ways to be accommodating of some of the worst things he says, but I think it's because she knows that she's in a long game.
Yes.
And if she allows herself to be drawn in, to object to every single thing he says, or to lose her composure with him, it will play into all of his tactics.
Yeah, and it's funny you should say the long game, because I picked up a really lovely quote from her when he asks her at some point if he appalls her, to which she says he has his moments, but she also says more than once that she loves him. And he says, but if I appall you, why do you love me? And she says, this is just one afternoon of many. I thought that was beautiful. And it obviously plays to the long game. And you're right. I guess she does know how to play him in that long game.
Yeah.
She knows when to stand up and to steer him towards what she requires and is best for him. She's protective and pragmatic.
Yeah.
And you think she's managing him well in some ways. And also, I was going to say, he seems to adore her. He knows he needs her.
Totally. I mean, it's a very codependent relationship. They have invested a huge amount in each other in the years leading up to this moment. They, in some ways, have what they wanted. And he utterly adores her and needs her, relies on her, and she him. So I guess the challenge of writing Lissy was to think, well, you now have the full awareness of an unconscionable aspect of your partner's personality, and you have to find a way to compartmentalize it and live with it and remind yourself of all the other things that are wonderful about them. This is one afternoon of many. This is one aspect of many, you know.
I mean, it's hard not to think, though, it's going to be slightly more challenging, and she's going to have to ride it out when she discovers what really goes on at the end of the play, when he effectively double crosses them, which we'll come to. Can we move on to the character of Tom Mashler then? He was, of course, as we've said several times, a real person. You've also created a fascinating, rounded character who acts as a sort of foil to Dahl, I think, and the madness that keeps breaking out around him. How did you approach developing the character we see on the stage? Because he offers an important perspective and balance in the play.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to talk about him without talking about Jesse Stone. But also, if you talk about both of them through the politics, it sort of makes the play feel a bit schematic, which I hope it isn't. But, you know, certainly Jessie is from Manhattan. She comes from a world in which there's a great many more Jewish people. In New York, she works in publishing, and I think her worldview is much more certain and supportive of Israel and what it meant and means and what the project of Israel could have been. She was probably born in 1948 when Israel was created, voted into existence. And Tom, in some ways, his views are very different. He was actually born in Germany and escaped on a kind of kinder transport on a train when he was a child, now feels very British and lives in a country where there are far less Jews, some of whom are very supportive of Israel. For him, he's much more ambivalent and doesn't feel that he is sort of the ambassador every time someone asks him about Israel. He feels that people talk to him as if he, as a Jew, should somehow speak for the whole of Israel. And for him, it's not a country he identifies with in the same way. He's English, he feels, and he feels that he's being othered every time someone demands that he justify the actions of the Israeli army in another part of the world. And that sort of dialectic, I guess, between those two characters is a really important part of the play.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? The degrees, the differences in the relationship of these two Jewish people with Israel, the strength of the connection or concern, involvement, engagement with. And as you say, Mashler presents an alternative where he says, I'm English, I'm Tom Mashler, primarily, before he's saying he's Jewish, or certainly before he's a representative of the state of Israel.
I think that that's exactly it. I think when Tom's asked, well, who are you? And he says, well, I guess I'm Tom Mashler. And I think that's really important. I think that Tom knows only too well, having escaped Nazi Germany and the possibility of losing his life there as a child, he understands only too well what happens when things get very tribalized. And I think on some level, he's not part of any tribe. He's just Tom. And he doesn't want to be told what he is and labeled and put in a box.
Well, it's interesting because he has a speech, doesn't he, about his school days and his history of living as a Jew in Britain, where he has been racially taunted. And he has just, as he said, ignored it. And he's had to accommodate himself to this and sort of assimilate himself. That also becomes a bit of a trigger for Dahl to have a go at him, saying, you compromising yourself, you're a house Jew, he says, which is quite shockingly spiteful coming from Dahl at this point, I thought, because Mashler is nothing but a devoted friend, supporter of Dahl. So when he has a go at him...
It's hard to summarize that scene without watching it, because the steps towards Dahl saying that vile thing, house Jew, which is a deliberately provocative echo of an horrendous American racist term, Dahl is in some ways always being ironic and dancing on lines of irony.
It's almost playful initially, right?
It's playful because he's saying, if I am an anti-Semite, Tom, as I've been accused of being, if I am, and you, as a Jew, don't make a proper objection to me and to working with me, then what does that make you? Well, it makes you a house Jew, doesn't it? He's questioning Tom's courage and his authenticity in this moment.
But he's also arguing whether he is really an anti-Semite, because if he was an anti-Semite, he would hate Tom.
Exactly.
And so he's saying, Tom, do I really hate you? Do you think I really hate you?
Yeah, exactly.
Therefore, if I don't hate you, I'm not an anti-Semite.
Exactly. So it becomes a way of having a theoretical debate whilst also being vile and being controlling and all those things. So yeah, and in a way, what I tried to write in the play is it's hard to in some ways know who's right and who isn't in these moments, because there's such ironic distance held on some of even the most disgusting things that Dahl says. And I should say at this stage, Tom is based on a real person, but there are many, many differences between, I think, the real Tom Maschler and the character that I've eked from some of those details. Because, you know, Tom, I think in real life was a much more alpha person. I mean, Tom in some ways is quite alpha in the play, but he has to be to bob and weave around Dahl's dominating behaviour. I think in real life, maybe the real Tom Maschler wouldn't have stomached and suffered some of the things that Dahl says in the play as much.
But you get drama and conflict between him and Jessie Stone as well, because she would say that he is compromising too much. But in response, again, this wonderful complexity of the arguments in the play is that Tom has this wonderful speech where he defends his compromise on the basis of the value of Dahl's art. It's one of the themes of the play about the separation of the artist and what one might feel about the character of the artist and their art. So he says he's willing to overlook whatever shortcomings Dahl might have in this particular moment even, because of the value of what he's written. And he has this wonderful speech championing the value of reading for children and how actually in balance that's more important, because that creates thinking adults, culturally aware adults. I mean, you could lift that out as an argument for literacy worldwide. I thought it was so eloquent.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's important. And I think that speech comes from Tom downplays his survival of Nazi Germany. But when it comes to defending reading, I think those insights, the importance of independent thinking that childhood books can cultivate, is in some ways coming from something deeper, which is what happens when fascism takes over and people
burn the books.
Yeah, and it's reduced to these very narrow lines of divisive thinking. So he is in some ways very humanly political, even though he doesn't in some ways consciously join the dots between his childhood and his passion for children's books.
I mean, it also gets confused, of course, by the fact that they have commercial interests, both these publishers. Their job is to preserve the potential sales of The Witches, which is about to be published, and all of Dahl's books. But just staying with the subject of art and the artist, I think it's also beautifully encapsulated in the character of Jessie Stone and her son, to whom she has read Dahl's books. Now, Jessie reacts more strongly in response to Dahl's statements and his behavior, and is actually personally outraged and has great difficulty with his position and the way he behaves. And yet her son Archie, she has read Dahl's books too, and in fact continues to, but he throws the question at her, will she continue to read the books? And you mentioned earlier, and I noticed in the acknowledgement at the back of the published text of the play, that you read to your boys. They're the next generation of Roald Dahl readers. So I assume from that you're not canceling his art. And nor, I think, ultimately does Jessie Stone. She decides, doesn't she, that she's not going to deprive her son of the joy of the books, although she says she would find it hard to explain why, certainly at whatever age. It's complicated.
Yeah, well, that's the word, isn't it? I think the idea of cancelling an artist presents us with, I mean, it's very hard to generalise, isn't it? But presents us with a very clean option, like a sort of clean blade. But it doesn't necessarily get us anywhere. And I guess that's what the play is sort of trying to do, is invite us to remember that if the artist has been objectionable in their life in some way, offensive, racist, whatever, and you know that about them, but you still love their work, then you have to make a judgment about how you approach their work. Does it complicate your relationship with them? It doesn't necessarily mean you just have to sit with the complexity. It's about sitting with two truths rather than just cleaning out the discomfort and pretending it doesn't exist.
No, that's really well put. Two truths actually accords exactly with something I'd just written down, which is to accept these contrary features as facets of humanity that we're obliged to hold simultaneously together in whatever balance we choose or can. And the other route of canceling, as we've just touched on, is dangerous, because where does that stop? And in fact, I was intrigued, having personally been both a bookseller and publisher in my life. I was fascinated by the details you portray of the book industry response to the controversy in the form of primarily Jessie Stone, and where she talks about the booksellers threatening to remove Dahl's books, effectively to cancel him, and the publishers, of course, are maneuvering to protect their commercial interests. Do you know, did booksellers or libraries really threaten to remove Dahl's books at this point?
Not that I know of. I mean, one of the big sort of high-stakes moments is when Jessie says the New York Times have been in touch. They might run a story ahead of the launch of The Witches. And I don't know that that happened. What I know is one of the threats to Dahl in the play is an offstage conjuring of the American Libraries Association, which was very powerful and did at times put some of Dahl's books occasionally on lists, on persona non grata lists. They're quite moral at times, and of course they're working in regions. So he did get into trouble with some of the stuff. There was letters written by school children who got very disturbed, Jewish school children in America who wrote to him saying, I love your books, but why do you hate me? There was a kerfuffle, and I don't know if it coalesced around active, concrete objections to publishers. And certainly, as I said, I have no idea if the action of the play even happened. I doubt very much it did, that, his English and US publishers descended on his house in order to get him to make some statement. So it's all confected, but I think it's based on degrees of truth.
It rang pretty true to me, and it seems pretty current too. So I think you've been somewhat prophetic, possibly even, because I know examples where some form of cultural canceling goes on. I mean, there's an expectation, for example, that as cultural centers, bookshops have an additional responsibility to be moral arbiters. I know that, the bookshops in this country have had objections and criticisms at times about what they display in their windows. And this past year at the American Booksellers Association, some very vocal members stood up demanding that the trade association should be taking a stance and making a statement against U.S. armed support for Israel in support of Palestine. And, we know about books being banned in schools or libraries in Florida. And so I think this does touch a real nerve in that respect. Okay, quickly, I didn't want to forget that you mentioned two other characters in the play. One is Hallie, the New Zealand cook, and it's a relatively small part, but she does keep coming in, and Dahl repeatedly tries to draw her into the argument. And I wondered why does she exist in your matrix of these characters in the debate?
First of all, we're not at a time where everyone is switched on to every global issue in the way that people feel they are now through endless exposure to it on their social media feeds. So she's someone who is setting out in the world innocent, in some ways naive of these arguments, but they have a kind of nice dynamic, and he enjoys provoking her into taking a stand. He likes to put her in the position that he feels he's in. Take a stand, speak your mind, stop being told that things are too complicated to make he puts his pain onto her in a way.
I presume he wants her to agree with him.
Yeah, I think so. I think also she starts to remind, it's very subtle, but it did occur to me as I was writing it how close in age she is to his late daughter, Olivia, who he has just talked about being 28 at the time. Hallie's 26. And he's just had a scene with the gardener where they've speculated, what would Olivia say about this? And then in comes Hallie, walking into the most sort of acute moment. So in a way she stands in unconsciously for a lost daughter.
He's thinking, what would Olivia say?
In a way, yeah, in a way. It doesn't matter if that's not something that we immediately realise in the playing of the scene. It's something that we did talk about in rehearsals, and somehow it infuses their conversations with those sort of unconscious emotion.
I think you're right. She seems to me to represent, as you said, in a way, a non-aligned perspective initially, because she's not Jewish.
No.
And not deeply informed or invested, as you've said. And he wants her to take some sort of stance, to be engaged, because he would want people to be engaged in this issue, and he believes his point of view should be heard, I suppose.
Yeah.
But she gives no answers until at the very end, when he insists that she listen to his conversation with the journalist on the telephone, who he's phoned up deliberately to give some quotes to. And she appears to be increasingly uneasy with what he's saying and leaves. And shortly after the call ends, Hallie cannot be found anywhere in the house or outside. So has she left for good? What's happened?
I think whether she's left for good at that moment or she leaves for good on her prearranged end of her time in the house, I think on some level she's left for good. She's finally, in some ways, taken his advice and taken a stand. To me, it seems that at least there she can draw a line about what she believes, and what she's heard is unacceptable to her, I think.
Let's jump to the end. And again, spoiler alert, it's an extraordinarily dramatic coup. A quite shocking twist in a way that leaves the audience stunned and deeply unsettled, I thought. Certainly I was. Just to sketch it in, the feud between Jessie Stone and Dahl, because it is quite a feud. Jessie does not hold back, but she's also devastated by the cruelty of his attack, is desperate to leave, and they have this, seems like, ultimate fallout. But it occurs between them when Tom and Lissy, I think, are out of the room. But when Tom and Lissy return, Dahl very unexpectedly says that he's going to go along with Tom's plan to do an interview with a friendly journalist, which would amount to some conciliation or apology even, which Tom and Lissy think is a great win. Jessie remains suspicious, rightly so, as it turns out, and he gets on the telephone, and this is truly what happened. He did this interview with Michael Coren, a young journalist at the New Statesman who'd been asking for a quote, and he launches into an extraordinary anti-Semitic diatribe, deliberately doubling down and sabotaging any damage limitation plan that Tom and Lissy have been trying to organize. And it's a horrifying sequence. I believe that all of what he says is verbatim.
Yeah, pretty much.
Though it comes from several different sources, which you've reorganized and amalgamated.
That's correct. Yeah. So he did do a telephone interview with the New Statesman in this exact timeline in real life. And so much of it is from that and from an interview I did with that journalist. And it's combined with an interview he gave right at the end of his life in 1990 with the Independent on Sunday. So I've stitched it together, but it's 92% Dahl's own words.
It amounts to a devastating impact and indictment. It's very painful and shocking to listen to, both for what he says and for the fact that we also see that he's actively enjoying this, it seems, because, as I think we've said, he's genuinely angry because he believes he is right, that he's speaking a truth that he believes and needn't apologize for, but he's really enjoying it. And there's a little element of that, I thought, in what happens after he hangs up, when Lissy returns to the room, and she has no idea what he's just done. And he gets all lovey-dovey with her, like suggests possibly they have some afternoon sex.
Yeah. I mean, he certainly feels like he's back in control. He's been feeling, as you referenced a little bit earlier, he has been feeling insecure about his relationship with her. And maybe now she seems to be glowingly happy that he's come through for her. He can lean into that.
So why does he torpedo it, though? I mean, it's a pretty shocking betrayal.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to pin it down to any one thing. I think, as we discussed, he brings the world back to a kind of conveniently explicable level. Like he's sitting in a maelstrom of a kind of blizzard of other people's points of views and complexities, and being told that people don't see the things as he sees things. And I think that when he resorts back to these sort of medieval anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, he's able to calm things down for himself, reduce things to a simplistic sort of almost moral pantomime where things are clearly right or clearly wrong. And I think that's going on, but I think there are many other things going on. I think he's, in some ways, what he's been accused of throughout the play, particularly by Jessie, is he's been hurt and wounded in a way because he sees himself, and he uses this word a lot in the play, he sees himself as a profoundly honourable man. And when Jessie accuses him of anti-Semitism, and worse, of behaving almost like a Nazi, That is the worst thing to say to a man whose self-image is of being an honourable, heroic RAF pilot. I think by the end of the play, what he's managed to do through the experiences he has is somehow integrate his racism into a system of honour. That he can actually be honourable in this justified reading of Jewish people. And so he can be calm with it. And I think also there's, he's someone who has a libertarian quality, like I talked about, when his back's against the wall, when he feels like he's being forced to do something, he'll come out swinging and say all sorts of outrageous things. I'm not saying that his anti-Semitism is just purely performative, but there is a performance quality to it. So it's many things at once. It's a deeply hateful narrative that can explain away the complexities of the world and keep them simple. It's a corrective. It's a fixer. It fixes things. It's a middle finger up to all the people that are telling him how to do things, how to behave, what action to take. It's many things at once that I think are going on.
Well, yeah, very complicated. And I wondered what you hope that audiences are left with, because in the balance of things, we end with these very extreme opinions from Dahl. And they are perhaps freshest in our mind as we leave the theater, especially given how dramatically you've set this up and his betrayal. And in real life, these statements are an enduring stain on his reputation, such that in 2020, Dahl's family published a statement on the official Roald Dahl website apologizing for his anti-Semitism. The quote was, "The Dahl family and the Roald Dahl Story Company deeply apologize for the lasting and understandable hurt caused by some of Roald Dahl's statements. Those prejudiced remarks are incomprehensible to us and stand in marked contrast to the man we knew and to the values at the heart of Roald Dahl's stories, which have positively impacted young people for generations. We hope that, just as he did at his best, at his absolute worst, Roald Dahl can help remind us of the lasting impact of words." It is words that do the damage.
Yeah, it's a powerful statement and beautifully written, I think. I guess I set out to write something that, in the first instance, was interested in pricing apart the difference between meaningful political conversation and prejudiced, hateful language, and where one stops and the other begins. But I guess through the portrait of a complex human being, I've tried to explore where someone is full of paradoxes and dualities, and there are things we can admire and things that we can't accept, and where truth lies is for all of us to find.
Great. Thank you, Mark, so much. It's been fascinating to explore this play. Before I let you go, one of the traditions of the podcast is I like to ask my guests to recommend another play. It could be one that we would cover on the podcast. We haven't already done so, but it doesn't have to be. It could just be a personal favorite. And I'd just love to hear if you have a play that you really love.
I'm sure everyone says this is such a hard decision to make, but I thought I'd go for a play I saw recently at the Royal Court, A Good House by Amy Jeffter, which is a South African play set in a housing development in which a kind of mysterious hut has sprung up and no one quite can work out who lives there. And it's a play about race and complexity and land and social relationships between people. It never settles on right and wrong. It's a really funny, lively, brilliantly written perspective on really complex issues, and I really loved it.
Yeah, it's unsettling about race. It's a black couple who move into a white residential area, is that right?
That's exactly right, yeah.
And yeah, it's very unsettling because all of the pretending that goes on by these white neighbors welcoming them, but not really.
Yeah. And even the pretending that starts to be revealed between the black couple and between the man and the woman in that relationship is really where it's just a fantastically nuanced piece of writing.
Yes. Thank you for that recommendation. So Giant continues at the Harold Pinner Theatre in London's West End until the 2nd of August. It has rightly received more 5-star reviews than anything I've seen in recent years. So if you can get a ticket, go. Mark, it is a fantastic achievement. Congratulations.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And thank you for such a fantastic conversation about it. And thank you for all of your deep thinking about it. I've really enjoyed this.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for coming. As the curtain falls on the temporary quiet after Dahl has unleashed his storm of abuse, we are left stunned by the cold connivance of his deception, by the horror of his unconstrained prejudice, and by how a human being can revel in such hatred. And not just any human being, but an artist whose imagination has also created childlike joy. It may be impossible to reconcile our contrary feelings about the artist and their art. The play stirs up many contradictory thoughts, and in so doing is itself a powerful reminder of the lasting impact of words, at their best and their worst, as the Roald Dahl estate rightly acknowledged. Thanks for listening. See you next time. There are additional footnotes about this and every other play that we cover in the podcast available to our patrons. Patrons also enjoy early access to our sister podcast, The Play Review, in which Jody Rylett and I share our views on current productions on the London stage. To become a patron, please visit our website at theplaypodcast.com. And don't forget to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts so as not to miss an episode. Thank you again for listening. See you next time.